Welcome to Authentic Living with Roxanne, a place where we have conscious conversations about things that really matter in our lives. And now here's your host, Roxanne Derhage.
Hi everyone, it's Roxanne Derhage, Authentic Living with Roxanne. Thanks for tuning in again this week. Today I have a colleague that I've spent quite a lot of time with in the last little while. Back in January we were in Toronto together and have gotten to know each other very, very well. Lindsay Lapaquette. Lindsay is a workplace communication expert, and in this day and age, not that communication hasn't been very important, but even more vitally important in the times that we're in. So Lindsay, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Roxanne. I'm excited to talk to you again.
So she's a repeater. She's been on once before, but she has lots more she can share. So Lindsay, obviously, you know, and everyone I know often will discuss the importance of communication. And even more so in this time, it becomes something that I think is separating out people that were maybe struggling before, and maybe people that have had to pivot quickly in reference to a lot of the companies or even the leadership or some of the frontline employees, companies that I've been talking to. So let's just jump right into what you're seeing with communication and some of the different needs that are coming about, or are they different in this kind of time of uncertainty?
Yeah. So I think the patterns are the same or similar, but they're really being amplified. So I'm seeing that people who have a tendency to listen and be empathetic and help others out are doing that considerably. Those who have a tendency to become much more stressed and to pass that stress on in the way they communicate, that's coming out more. And I don't want to say that it's necessarily one or the other. So for myself, I'm both more empathetic and also at times more stressed and passing on that stress in the way I convey to others. So I think, like I said, there's similar patterns, but it's affecting us more to stronger extents right now.
So obviously we know that stress impacts us in so many ways. And, I've often said, and I think probably multiple times on this podcast, that if you're saying you're not stressed right now, I would be checking for a pulse, because we are all stressed. Before Lindsay and I got on, we were talking about her with her 2 children at home, and her husband both trying to juggle their business and the hours and hours of homework that her kids are getting. And Lindsay lives in Quebec. And from a lot of the people that I'm also coaching, there's so much more pressure because now everything's living under the same roof. Whereas before, we could kind of leave the environment, de-stress in certain ways. All those things are now gone, right? We used to complain about commutes, which sometimes commutes were a de-stressor, if you think about it. And now people used to say, I couldn't wait for that 20 minutes to kind of jump in the car and drive down the highway, and then before I know it, I'm home, and then I'm kind of feeling like I'm pivoted out of it. That's something that's, say, for instance, been lost. So stress is definitely, I would say, exponentially gone up. And so, of course, that's going to impact people's ability to, like you say, be more empathetic, because people at home maybe are feeling a little bit more under the radar. A lot more pressure on them, and their roles are all in the same space. So how when you train, and Lindsay does a lot of training with communication, how do you approach teaching about stress and the impact on communication in workplaces?
Yeah. So can I actually share a story before I get to your question?
Sure.
Well, let me address your question a bit at the same time. So for me, the way we communicate with one another is intimately tied to our awareness of how we are feeling in the moment, whether we're aware of how stressed we are or not. So are we saying to somebody, I need a minute, I'm feeling really stressed right now, I can't think about that at the moment, I can't concentrate? Or are we yelling at them when we get interrupted because we're not even necessarily aware of how stressed we are or don't have the skills to communicate that differently? And so the story I'd actually wanted to share was that my son yesterday, so my kids have just started online schooling this week. And last night he actually said to me, Mommy, it's really hard for me to go on Zoom and off again and have to go back and pay attention again to switch between school and home and school and home. It's too hard for me. And I said to him, you know, Logan, everyone in the world right now is struggling with how, I said, we used to have home in one spot, work in another. For some, those were already combined, like you and I. But home in one spot, work in another, and school in another space. And so we knew when we were in that space what we had to focus on, and it didn't all blend together. And I said, now that's kind of been smushed up. I was explaining it to a 10-year-old, and we're trying to figure out all of this. And so that awareness of how our circumstances has changed and how that's going to affect how we're managing the situation is going to help us communicate better, because instead of ranting and raving about things that are going on, which, you know, happens to the best of us, myself included, we can have more productive conversations around what's not working and find solutions. So when I work with individuals or organizations, a lot of the work I do is helping bring an awareness to when they are in what I call the reactive zone of communication, which is the zone where we are responding instinctually, right? Instinctively, we're not, there's not necessarily space between what we're experiencing on an emotional level and how we're reacting. Or are we in what I call the receptive zone of communication, whereas where something upsetting might happen, but we have the awareness to sort of give ourselves time to come down from that big upset. And that often can help us make a better decision in terms of how we're interacting with the world. So that's a lot of the core of the work that I do with organizations.
It's creating that gap, right? I often say that it's kind of like something happens, I'm stressed, I react, I do something, and then I go, oh God, I should have thought that one through, or
Right.
I could have done that a little bit better. So it's really kind of teaching people about those zones, and each person is so different, right?
Yeah.
In reference to the reaction. And sometimes some people are unaware potentially how abrupt they might come across or how
Right.
cryptic they might become until someone says, do you realize, Kanye, that you came across a little bit, rude, or, and then they go, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. Sometimes it's that lack of awareness, to your point. And then they might go, oh, that's just my way. And not understand the impact that they're having on the person across from them. So I would think that education piece probably would be very, very vital for people to start to understand.
Absolutely. So I see there's 4 sort of fundamental pieces to effective communication. And I think a lot of work on communication centers around sort of what I see as the top layer, which is what words do I say? How do I start an interaction when I'm feeling awkward and don't want to address the subject? And those are all important things. But if you dig a little deeper, you have to be able to manage your reactions to emotions going on, or manage, when you're feeling really uncomfortable or feeling really upset, you have to be able to manage those feelings to be able to stay in that interaction and not either blow up or want to disappear. You have to have an awareness of your own behaviors and your own, what's going on inside of you. And then you have to have an understanding of someone else's reality of the situation. So the ability to take put yourself in somebody else's shoes, essentially, and see the situation from their point of view. And then it's how we communicate with each other. Because if you focus just on the words we use, but you haven't understood the other person's perspective, or, you're not aware that you're being too abrupt, you can only get so far.
So stressors are high, to your point. So I'm going to say there's probably a lot of people bumping up against each other, because they are so stressed. And, we're talking about what can you do, those types of things, but it becomes a little bit more difficult. I know when people are pivoting into, to your point, you and I have worked, we work from home a lot other than when we travel. So we've kind of, I've been virtual now going back, since 2003 with my corporate. And, on how poorly I did it then, starting off. And then, obviously when I started my own business, was in 2010. It's a difficult transition, when you kind of try to do it, because we're so accustomed, to seeing people and connecting, right? And then if let's say I have a conflict with you, Lindsay, it's easier if I have to walk past your office, kind of, and I'm thinking, oh, I have that thing to talk to Lindsay about, but I keep seeing you, so it's going to kind of keep coming up. But when I'm kind of in the context of seeing you here, and that stress, I would think, could potentially be even deeper ingrained in me, in that I have to hold it together to be able to have the conversation, but there's not the impetus of running by you at the coffee station or in the lunchroom, so I can kind of put things a little bit deeper. Do you find that in the virtual environment, sometimes things can go get a bit more hidden and become a bit explosive?
Absolutely. So explosive in the sense that I think there's a lot more brewing under the surface that isn't getting addressed because there isn't that ongoing contact in between. So let's say you're on a virtual meeting with a team and somebody says something that upsets you, and it's harder to, if there's, I don't know, say 10 people on the call, it's harder for you to interject in that moment to say something, because other people can't, there's little squares on a Zoom call. Nobody's, or not nobody, but it's not as likely somebody is going to notice your body language that is showing that you're upset. And so the moment might go unnoticed, and then it's on you to then bring that up, but the conversation keeps flowing. And then a few minutes later, it starts to feel like it's not timely anymore to bring that up. And then because you don't bump into that person in the hallway, if you are someone who would have addressed it, it might just disappear. And those tensions, I think, are building a lot right now in people, because everyone's already really strapped in terms of their pressures at home, the pressures in the workplace. People, I've spoken to companies who have told me they are trying their best to make sure their employees are feeling appreciated, and, they want to retain their employees and keep them motivated. But they said to me, we know our next product needs to get out by deadline, or we don't have the cash flow to pay our employees. So if we don't get this out, they also feel they need to sort of squeeze the employees to get the work done, because they don't want to tell the employees, hey, your job is depending on this product. So I think all of that really feeds into how little tensions are building up more, because people's buckets are already full. There's not a lot of space for extra little stressors. And so they bother people a lot more than, whereas something before you might have let that go, or it might not have bothered you as much. People are on edge for understandable reasons.
Well, because of the fear, right? Like, here in Ontario, we were talking about getting out from phase 1 into phase 2, and now they've delayed phase 1 because we've seen a spike in cases again here. So here we are, we're kind of trucking along, kind of thinking, oh, we're getting a little bit better. And now the pause button's been hit again. So that fear level that we've all have, and it's kind of, we're maybe managing it, and now it's going up a little bit more. So, and you put that, like you said, and most people are working from home. If you have a job, and a lot of people have to be thankful they do, but still, even in that space, people are still wondering, am I going to have a job when this lifts? So that's an additional, that's like that's like turning up the heat on the Bunsen burner even higher, right? Absolutely. So your point, like you're talking about, maybe leadership is saying, we got to get this product out by deadline, because we're not going to have the cash flow to be able to keep our employees. So you could understand whether, that stress level is bubbling at a such a higher level.
Yeah. Or even so, I look here in Quebec. So, non-essential businesses were allowed to open. I think it was May 11th outside of Montreal. And then in Montreal, it was just this past Monday, May 25th. And there are employees who don't feel safe going back to work, right? They might be in a position where they live with somebody who is, let's say, immunocompromised. And so I will caveat to say I have not read any new any new documentation coming out in the past week or so. So this might have changed, but about a week ago, the rules from the equivalent of what would be WSIB or workers safety were that if you lived with someone at risk, you still, I think you get 10 days of sick time you can use to care for someone, but beyond that, you need to return to work if your employer is asking you to. And so that stress, I can't imagine how huge that must be. My husband is high risk, and I'm grateful I'm not in a position where I have to decide, do I leave my job in an economy where I don't know how I might get another, or do I potentially put a family member at risk? So I think all of these, each person is experiencing a different combination of these types of stressors, some more than others. But overall, stress levels are high, and it's affecting immensely, I think, how we communicate with others. I mean, you can see it on social media, how people are tearing into one another with, people who have different opinions. Or even this morning, I haven't been out in a car a lot since COVID, and I drove home this morning and a lady cut me off and, honked and gave me the finger. And, I thought there's a reflection of how stressed people are.
Yeah, that's a reality. So if we go back again to the element of in-person, we have less of that. We have a lot more things kind of layered up. We could have our separate kind of lives. We'd have our personal lives, and we'd have our workplace lives, and then we'd have our social lives. And even that, I mean, it's come down to screen time to be able to see family members and family, those types of things. So the nonverbal element, let's talk a little bit about that, right? Because I mean, I'm seeing, half of you, you're seeing half of me. There's two of us, so I can and I know Lindsay very well, so I kind of know a bit of her nuances. I think she would know a bit of mine. But if we were on the screen, potentially with 20 other, or maybe say a team of 15, and there's dissension or conflict a brew, like how are you reading? Potentially, if I'm the lead of the team, or even if I'm working on a project within the team, how am I able to read the verbals or the verbals we're hearing, but the non-verbals on an ongoing, I would think that would be something that would be a little bit more difficult now.
Absolutely. Well, let's just look at the fact that if you want to give people the impression you're looking in the eye, looking them in the eye, you need to be looking at the camera and not the person on the screen.
Right. And I'm not looking at the camera, I'm looking at you. So I probably look like I'm off looking somewhere else.
Yeah. And I'm looking at the camera, so I'm not following your nonverbal.
See? And these are two people that do this stuff all the time.
Yeah. And so with you, I feel I know you well enough that I can look at the camera and I kind of have a good feel for, I don't have that same need to read your nonverbal. I was on a networking call with 16 brand new people just prior to this, and I couldn't look at the camera because I don't know any of them. And I needed to see that information on their face. So the fact that it looks like someone is looking at you and they're not, or if they are looking at you, it looks like they're not. That's a big disconnect in the way we are used to, measuring whether or not somebody is paying attention to us, right? Because before, averted eyes was a sign that somebody was perhaps not paying attention, whereas now it's a sign that somebody may be looking at you right on the screen. And unless you know that explicitly and have thought that through, you may read that incorrectly.
Absolutely. And what a good point, right? So that affinity comes from us knowing each other. However, with all the stressors that we're talking about on teams, their attention is, I'm going to say, probably you're potentially seeing a different iteration of your team members, because we're all dealing with this, and maybe east to west coast, or a couple of different locations. so, and then people are trying to come together to work on common projects, maybe that they started prior to, and then all of a sudden they're having to work again. So I could see how there'd be a lot more miscommunication or misreading of nonverbals. And if I'm a hand user, so people would expect me to use my hand. But if I'm kind of trying to think really, let's say I'm really, really stressed, I might be trying to kind of be a bit more contained, but that may be perceived as, well, Roxanne's not listening, or she's not as fluid, or what's up with her, or there's so many variations that could be if you perceive me as acting differently from what you're accustomed to, even though the context is a screen versus in person.
Yeah. And so one thing I found really helpful so I've done a lot of remote work prior to COVID hitting. And I have led groups of, maybe 20 people through big discussions on big topics via Zoom. And that's hard because when you're trying to get the read on what everyone thinks about a project, when you're not in person, what I found was it got to be hard to both lead the discussion and truly reflect on what everyone was saying and moderate speaking time and making sure people were heard and reading other people's nonverbal, which I can do very well in person. I found it much more challenging online. And what I had moved to doing in my business was that I would have somebody with me. Mm-hmm. So if I'm leading the discussion, I have somebody with me from my team who's reading other people's nonverbal, who may then, like after I finish saying something or somebody else may say, I just noticed that John seemed a little confused about that point. John, do you have a question? Because it's harder when as a participant to interject, because usually what happens is one person stops talking and five will start if you're in a group of 20. Because that nonverbal, you can't see them leaning forward, so they're the next one who's going to speak. All that information is missing in many ways.
That's a good point. So already having a second set of eyes, because we're not physically in the same space, and oftentimes you can do that in person too. You might miss a cue, but you could kind of scan the room and quickly pick that up again. But so definitely getting someone to assist you or moderate with you is a helpful thing.
Yeah.
What are some tips then that you think that you would give people to help them? Let's say, there's leaders on, we're talking about awareness, and I talk a lot about authenticity and awareness, and how does what you do align with what you value as a leader and as an employee, all those things. But are there some basic tips that you could give people that just want to communicate better, period, verbally, non-verbally? What are some of the basic things that you think people might consider or might maybe start to apply? And maybe some of it would be really basic, but I think sometimes we assume that people know some of the things that we're talking about.
Yeah. So I think one of the ones for, when we're virtual, is that we really have to be mindful of the space that everyone is taking. This is true live, obviously, as well, but, it becomes, I think, even more difficult for someone who is more introverted to interject in a virtual setting. The other thing is that not everyone is going to be comfortable, on virtual. When you speak, if you're in speaker view, you're now on the full screen. Not everyone's going to be comfortable in a larger meeting being in the spotlight like that. So being mindful of how you're setting up activities and expectations to meet the comfort level and personalities of different individuals, I think is important. My son shared with me yesterday. So my son is quite introverted and has a lot of anxiety. And yesterday said to me, and he really doesn't like doing school on Zoom. And I was asking him why. And he said, I don't like having to talk in front of the class. And I said to him, do you have to talk in front of the class when you're at school? And he said, yes, it's different though. It's not the same. I feel so strange, and I think there are definitely adults out there too who this virtual world is difficult for. So can you make sure that those people have been heard by sending them a little message afterwards and saying, hey, we discussed this. I'm curious your thoughts on it. Or, finding ways to include them. Can you use, there's polls, Slido, I'm sure you're aware of, and there's other polls where people can share their opinions in ways that doesn't force them to have to be speaking in front of, in front of everybody else, but you're still ensuring they're participating. The other thing that I think is really important is ensuring that we're being a lot more explicit about communication. So I think this was needed before, but now more than ever, all those things that either are going unsaid or you're not sure of, you need to bring it up to clarify. So one example that I was told recently was a team who had a meeting and they had set a deadline, and one team had understood, or the leader, let's say, had set the deadline for next Friday, but the team had understood it was in 3 weeks. I'm not sure exactly how that happened, but what they told me was that had we been in the office, we would have bumped into one another and realized, somebody would have said, how's that project going? And they would have said, oh, we haven't started it yet because we have other priorities. It's not due for 3 weeks. That didn't happen because they didn't bump into one another. And so the day it was due or the day after, the person it was due to said, hey, where's this project? And it wasn't started. So, if we say, for instance, give the deadline, maybe have the person repeat back, can you just confirm to me, or like following up with an email. We have to be really careful on making sure the way we think we communicated, that's the same way the person received it.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? Because, I often say that in our little worlds, our communication is perfect, right? Until you have to send it to someone else. And then you realize, where'd you get that from? So it's, and I often say it's that figure eight, right? It's kind of, I send a message and then somehow it gets translated over here and then it comes back at you and you're like, oh, I didn't even say that. Like, where did you get that?
Yes.
So I think it's touching base, your introverts, making sure your introverts have a voice to say, I know we're going to put you on the spot here, Roxanne, you don't normally say much, but I just want to give people a platform that are less likely to be verbal. Like you said, things like having polls, sometimes maybe getting to the point where you do have a minute taker, even though maybe it wasn't the norm with most of your meetings, or a lot of times your Zoom meetings get recorded, not that people have the extra time, but if you, let's say you get lost in something, you can go back to the files to check the Zoom record to ensure you got those pieces. There's a lot of different things then that I would say you'd have to start to put in place.
Yeah. And I think also, at the end of that meeting, and I think many people do this already, but making a really concise summary of, okay, these are the decisions we've made. This is what we're focusing on. And so say that in the meeting, then send a really short email summary so that the expectations hopefully should be clear because they were stated in the meeting, they were summarized and recapped verbally, and then they were sent again in writing. And then of course, with the question of if there's any confusion, please reach out and let me know. I think somebody said this to me, and it made so much sense. They said, now is the time to over-communicate. And then if you've done that, you've communicated just enough.
It's not always the case, right?
Yeah.
Communicate, and then do some more just in case somebody missed the first 3 times. Yeah. And then still there's going to be things that go awry.
Yeah.
Now, in reference to if I'm on a team and there has been some residual conflicts, what's the best approach to go about in person? Obviously, you do a lot of resolving conflicts and stuff like that. But in this pivot, people didn't have time, right? Like it happened, March, 15, 16, 17, based on where you were. And all of a sudden people were home. And a lot of companies have just been trying to stay afloat since.
Yeah.
If I'm a team member and let's say I've had kind of ongoing conflict with maybe 1 or 2 other people, I've been able to manage it, but I'm finding now that with all the stressors and pressures at home that I'm having a more difficult time managing kind of communication on a team, what would be some of the things that you might suggest I should do
So
there?
if it's you who's having challenges with a specific team member, my suggestion first off, and this would be the same in person, would be to address it directly with the person, because
Mhm.
a lot of what I see happening is that that person who's having the difficulties instead goes straight to their supervisor, or sometimes even the supervisor's supervisor, and it doesn't give the opportunity to the person you're having difficulty with to say, oh, hey, wow, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that that was difficult, and to repair. And in fact, by not dealing with it with that person directly, you're sort of creating a bigger rift, because of course now they feel you've went behind their back, and they don't trust you. So of course this depends on the extent of what's going on, but I really think as a first step, it's addressing it with them and just saying, hey, earlier, when you mentioned that, when you said I was disorganized because I hadn't handed in, this whatever, I didn't appreciate being spoken about like that. So just saying what happened. So it's really about focusing on the behaviors and not insulting the person,
Mhm.
focusing on the behaviors you didn't like, stating what you don't like, and what you need respectfully and calmly. And then you're going to see what the other person's going to do. Some people may apologize. Some people may become even more disparaging. And if it gets to that point, then perhaps once you've attempted to address it a few times, I would say that's maybe the point at which you bring on a supervisor. But I think what I'm seeing and suspecting is going to continue happening is there are rifts happening in teams because these issues aren't being addressed. Like you said, people have been so busy and stressed. But there will be a cost to this in business when things slow down, and whether we end up back in the office or we stay remote, the cohesion needed to work well together on projects is going to be impacted if this stuff stays unaddressed long term.
It's kind of like the calm after the storm to some degree, right? We keep the ship afloat and then we relax, and all the things that all the ripple effects that we didn't address along the way really comes to the surface at that point, and then teams will have to address it. They'll have no industries or sectors will have to address it,
Yeah.
because then people won't be able to function the way that they need to be able to get back to optimal functioning.
Yeah.
No, for from the leader perspective, let's think a little bit about, we're talking about the stressors and stuff like that. What can leaders do? Like, so let's assume again that, like we're saying, everybody is dealing with things in a different way. People are maybe hyper functioning just to be able to secure their jobs. They're dealing with all the pressures that we've been discussing so far. So as a leader, what kind of things do you think? And now we also have to think that the leader has to take care of him or herself along the way, probably 10 times as much, because they have to come back and function with their teams. What could they do to kind of address some of the stressors, but at the same time keeping people accountable for their ability to communicate effectively?
Mm-hmm. So I think the one you said is to me is the foundation. Is if you do not take care of yourself as a leader, first of all, you're modeling behaviors to your employees that are not the behaviors you want them to adopt. So the first thing I think is really ensuring that you're doing what you need in your day, not just for your business, but for yourself, to be able to address situations calmly and productively and make decisions from a place that is not in that panicked state, which, it makes sense that so many have been in this state because the pressure people are under is immense. But, it might be really little things like going for a walk before you step into the office for 20 minutes, again for 20 minutes at lunch. If you have to take a call while you're walking at lunch, I mean, it's not, I do promote real breaks, but I know some people feel they can't take that right now. Just try your best to find the smallest of moments to bring some well-being into your life. To me, that's the foundation. beyond that, though, I think what I'm seeing is that it's employers who have been able to be flexible as they can, given the demands of their industry, who have been able to shift through this with the least impact on their employees. And I still think there's been impact on those employees with flexible employers, but you have to also look at the situation from an employee's perspective. So I was told by somebody that they were expecting their employees to be available from 9 to 5 with children or not on all calls as needed. And, it was not acceptable for a child to walk into the room. And I understand that from a business perspective. The reality is that that's an impossible setup for anyone who has young children.
Absolutely.
And so either as a leader, we're putting our employees in a position where they're going to start to resent you and their job, but they're going to stay because the economy is bad. There's not a lot of wiggle room here. So if you can look at, are there ways to, I was speaking with somebody earlier who their employees are getting up early and doing some work before the kids get up, doing some after the kids go to bed. But he also said, this is not sustainable at long term. We're looking for a solution to this because he recognizes that although he's been very flexible, the cost on his employees' well-being is going to impact how they're functioning at work, right? You cannot be on from 6 a.m. until midnight, day after day after day, and not see an impact on how people communicate with one another and on how productive they're going to be in their day. So I think leaders like him are going to fare best in this situation.
And I think, I was coaching someone earlier, and she gets up at 5, works till noon, so her husband could then get time. So she takes the children at noon, and then he gets to work from noon to 7 or whatever. So if you think about it, that's a lot, right? Because, 2 young children, they still have to do this, whatever, Zoom and all that. At some point, you're right. I remember when I was in corporate and we would talk about I'm going to date myself here, Lindsay, the BlackBerry policy, where you could stop at 5, you could send an email, and the service would not deliver it until 6 o'clock the next morning.
Oh, that sounds great. I didn't know that existed.
Yes, in corporate, we had to implement it way back when we went, because what would happen is somebody would get about 2 o'clock and they'd be working at something, let's say, because they couldn't sleep or they worked late, and they'd start sending things. So a lot of big companies instituted the policy that you could work on stuff, but know that if you sent it, once they put this policy in place, it wouldn't be delivered until 6 o'clock the next morning, which really kind of created that space for people to not think that, oh my goodness, Lindsay's working at 2:30 in the morning. What the heck am I doing? Sleep. They would create a lot of tension, right? But now we have the opposite because the workplace is in the home.
Yeah.
Right. So you don't have that disconnection. So I think the conscious leader would try to be as adaptable as possible to create the space, right, for people.
And I think, and I think the needs are different for different people, because when I talk to my colleagues who have older children, they're, I'm talking, sort of late teens age, their kids are online on school, all day during the day. And so they're able to get their work done in different ways. Whereas I speak to my sister who has, a young baby and a 2-year-old, they're struggling a lot more to get their work done. So I think there also needs to be an understanding that this is affecting different people differently. And we can't always see on the surface. So what I mean by that is, by looking at the factors of someone's life, how many children they have, or we don't always know all the pieces that play into that, right? And all of their responsibilities. So I think as a leader, it's also being sensitive to listening to what your employees are telling you, creating an environment where if somebody says to you, I'm doing everything I can to get my hours done and I don't know what else to do. I mean, I'm going to be honest and tell you, I don't even know the exact solution to that problem. But I think what you can do is open up the conversation, or be willing to listen to what they're saying, instead of just saying, well, listen, you owe us 7 hours a day and figure it out. You need to be available. I know you have kids, but this is your job. And if you want to keep it, do it. I think part of what people need is for you to hear how difficult it is. And instead of having the conversation that way, to be more empathetic. Like you talked about authenticity earlier, I think it's okay to share. I understand how difficult this is. We're all having a tough time with this right now, and ask them what they need. And sometimes what they're going to ask for is going to be so much smaller than what you fear.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's about communication and being open.
And really having people know in your questioning or your that you really care, right? Like there may be no perfect solution at the end of the day, but at least people feel validated, and that you're thinking about them. Like one particular CEO that I interviewed for my new book, he made a reach out call. Like he has 200 employees, and what he did is, that was what he did. They calendarized his day so that he could to reach out. He says, not a, hey, how you doing? Nice to talk to you, hang up, but really kind of chatted with, I don't want you to worry. I'm here. We're in it together. Let me know what you need. There's no pressure, so and I thought, wow, what a phenomenal thing. And, they try to set it up so that he could do a certain amount of calls every single day. I think at the time we talked, it was 7 weeks out, and he had almost done all 200 calls, right? So that
think
shows
of the
you.
impact,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
When you're struggling and, feeling like you can't keep up at this rhythm, and the CEO calls you and is like, hey, I hear you, I see you. Because that's essentially what they're saying in different words. I see your struggle. I appreciate you. I appreciate what you're giving to this company. It goes a really, really, I just got shivers saying that. It goes a long way. And I do think it's the companies who, when I look at the return to work, for instance, the people who are afraid to come back, those who are being told, you need to come back anyhow, this is the law, do it. If that person comes back and gets infected, and their loved one gets infected and dies, you may be facing a lawsuit. Because that employee may say the conditions were not safe, you didn't put in place enough safety measures. Whereas if you have a conversation with them and say, I understand. I understand your husband is high risk. I know how scary that must feel, very scary. I wish we could arrange things otherwise. Unfortunately, with the demands of the company right now, I don't know what else we can do, because we do need employees. And, basically show them the law and say that this is the situation we're in. I think at the very least, you're creating a relationship with that employee where, whether they return to work or not, it's not going to create that same toxic environment within the company as the other scenario.
Right. It's like Gladwell, and I think it was The Tipping Point, I believe, in one of his books, he talked a little bit about physicians that actually get sued versus ones that don't. When there's a death of a family member, and the ones that actually took the time, when he did the research, to get to know the family members, those were the least likely that they would actually take a litigious point of view if there was a death of a family member. So I think to those basics, right? Getting to really know someone. And I think we're in that space where we're really, all of us have that fear. I have 2 elderly parents, and, I know, like you said, your husband is immune compromised. Like there's lots of people that are worried, about their family members. So you can see that fear along with everything else. It's a lot of things swirling.
Yeah.
Lindsay, this has been phenomenal yet again. First time around, I think we talked about lots of different things, but what breadth you've brought to the space around communication. And I've learned so many little things today, and I'm sure that everybody else has learned lots of things listening. Is there anything else you want to kind of share before we let you go? And also, I would like you to let everyone know where they can get a hold of you if they're interested in having you do any kind of work with them.
Sure. So my website is lindsaylapaquette.com. I'll apologize for the door knocking as we discuss struggling to work from home. My website is lindsaylapaquette.com. And I'm actually just launching a new program that includes a virtual workshop for leaders and their teams, as well as ongoing coaching. And so you can check that out on my website. And I also have an e-guide on my website if you scroll down to the bottom of the homepage with tips on how to navigate difficult conversations at work, which I think is particularly pertinent in these difficult times. So go and check that out.
Okay, so for everyone, the one tip that I'm taking away is to look right at the camera.
Or not. Depending on
or not. If everybody's looking at me, they go, okay, we know how she talks. But just the little things, right? The small things that you don't think about. I think that, all kidding aside, is just to think about how could I clarify? And I'm an extrovert, so I sometimes don't think about the introverts and maybe don't think of the people that aren't going to share. And how could I engage people like that even more in my conversations? To think about them and to think what might somebody different from me, what might they need to be able to verbalize or even share in a different way. Naturally, as an extrovert, I just expect it's going to come flying out of everybody. And we know that that's really not the case. And sometimes it's not the best thing to be like that, but to really think about how different people communicate and what they might need different from me as the way I communicate. So again, Lindsay, thanks a lot for your time and for everyone for tuning in. As you know, I'm a mental health and wellness expert. I do speaking and training and consulting. You can reach me at roxannederhodge.com. Take care.
Thanks for tuning in to Authentic Living with Roxanne, creating the space for positive, healthy change. Roxanne is a keynote speaker, psychotherapist, and coach. To work with Roxanne, visit roxannederhodge.com/blueprint. We'll see you next time on Authentic Living with Roxanne.